Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to the talk today. My name is Nolan Erck, and we're going to talk about why testing is important. I'm going to do some slides and a few code samples. That's my GitHub repo, and that's my GitHub login, and that's my repo with all the stuff in it today. So if you're not a fast typer, if you don't want to take photos, you can just take a photo of this one spot, and then everything I show you today is up there. So you can just grab the PDF of the slides and the couple of code samples I have, and then you don't have to worry about taking 50 photos all day long or things like that. A little bit about me. I run South of Shasta. We are a developer consultancy. I have team members in the UK and in the US. We build a variety of web and mobile applications and provide training on different things. I'm also a VP of engineering for a tech startup in Sacramento called Emission Control. We're building a SaaS app for helping companies go green and use more electric equipment instead of gas and diesel equipment. I run SAC Interactive, which used to be our Sacramento Cold Fusion meetup, and we made it more of a general web and mobile development meetup a few years ago. I used to program video games for a living until I learned that was way too much work for not nearly enough money. And I'm willing to bet I go to more concerts than any of you in the room and buy more records. My house looks like this. I'm quite proud of my record collection. So the big question today, should you test your web app? Yes, absolutely test your web app. Write tests, do manual tests, grab people in the hallway and say, click on this thing and tell me what you think it should do. Whatever variation of testing you can do that variation of testing. There is no downside to doing that. One of the best pieces of advice I got when I was getting going in my career is one of the biggest differences between a junior developer and a senior developer is a senior developer will test their code. And it's not that they produce fancier code necessarily or more volume of it. It's that when they give you code into the new library or the new app or whatever, it generally works with fewer issues than maybe a more junior developer or someone who does not go through as much effort in testing the code. You can interpret testing to mean whatever variation of testing works best for your environment and your application. So testing is important because you want to find and fix your bugs. The sooner you find the issues in your app, the cheaper it is to find and fix those issues in your app. Customers finding your bugs in production is bad PR for you and your app and your company. It causes bad reviews on the different web platforms where people talk about software. You don't want to get a negative review in an app store. That can cause problems. There's no good thing that comes from having a customer find your application or find your bugs in your application once it's live. You want to find your bugs before they're in production, not after. There have been a bunch of tests. You can actually go onto Google and just type expense of finding bugs in software development, and 100 different pages will come up from 100 different tests and reports. They all look about like this. They all say it is mathematically 30 times less expensive to find and fix bugs early in the process than after they're live and in production. It takes, you don't have to hit pause on a production server. You don't have to email your customers and say, we're sorry, the site's going to be down while we fix an issue. If you find it early, you get rid of all those problems and can fix your apps more easily. So where do you start testing your application? You don't have to start by testing the login page first or testing a certain user interaction first. Pick whatever spot in your application seems easiest for you to get in and start adding testing to it, and just start there. And then you can build from that spot over time in your code base. I'll show you the current test suite that my team is using to test the application we're building right now called Fuse. It's got a couple hundred tests in it right now. It did not start with a couple hundred tests in it. It started with one test to make sure one thing worked, and we just have built onto it from there over time. You can obviously do manual testing. Just turn on your browser and click on the buttons and make sure that your code does what it's supposed to do. There's no thing blocking you from doing that. Everyone who's writing code should be able to do that right now. There are lots of options for getting fancier and more automated with that and testing your code. There are things like TestBox, which I'll show a little bit about, and Cypress, which I'll show a little bit about. There are also tools like CodeCept and Chai and Mocha and MXUnit if you've been around CF for a while, and a bunch of other things. It can be really easy to feel overwhelmed by, there are all these different test tools. They all do something different. Should I be using 9 of them to test my app really well? Don't worry about that. Don't worry about getting into analysis paralysis. Pick wherever you can start and just start writing your tests from there. You can always build to that process over time. I'll show you the testing things that my team is doing currently, which did not start out that way. We spent about a year developing this app, and we've added to the testing process over that last year to make things go a little bit better as our needs have grown. You can even start with like simple little makeshift test suites, if you will. Like here I have a math utility library that just does some basic functions. Obviously, the computations in whatever you're building might be more advanced than that. But the takeaway here is you could just write a simple test CFM file that includes that and then draw some output on the screen saying, I'm going to test my add numbers method, which looks like this. Take two numbers and add them together, return it back. Nothing crazy. And then I just test to make sure that I get the thing, the value out of it that I expect to get. And I can do the same thing writing a multiply numbers test, which checks this method here and make sure that it does, in fact, multiply numbers correctly the way I expect them to be. And I can run that. Am I running right now? I am not. So server start. And I can just simply click on my tests, and yay, my tests work, and it does what it's supposed to do. So I didn't have to install anything. I didn't have to configure testbox or any NPM stuff. You can simply write a CFM file and start testing your code like that. The downside to this, though, is I've got two tests in here, right? 1 and 2. They both throw an exception, excuse me, if the test fails for some reason. So let's say I have a bug in my add method minus. Instead of getting my 2 tests to run here, my first test tries to run, and then it throws that exception, and then nothing happens after that point in the file. So the first test ran, the second test stopped because they threw an exception, and that's just how this little primitive testing setup that I have behaves. So it kind of worked, but you can see that if I have one test fails, the rest of the file doesn't actually do anything. I also might want to have things like PDF outputs of here's the tests as they currently are in the app, which how many of them pass, how many of them fail. There's nothing I can do fancier with a simple file like that than just run the tests, do they all work? Cool. So I might want to start with that, but then build more things over time. Without adding tons of overhead to my development team, I want to make it easier to run all the tests at one time. Even if one of the tests fails, have the rest of the suite continue running so I can see if you have 10 tests, 8 of them passed, 2 of them failed, or what have you. It might be nice to get some summary stats on that kind of stuff, made it available, maybe output those results to a CSV file or a PDF file that I can email to management, things like that. And make some future decisions as the app grows a little bit easier for me. And that's where something like testbox would come into play. Testbox, if you're not aware, can be used to test any CFML application, not just Coldbox. I'm going to say that again. You can test any Cold Fusion app with testbox, not just Coldbox apps. The more structured your code is, the better the test results will be, but you can test like a generic CF include with testbox. It'll run and check the code inside there for you. You can run custom tags, and testbox will tell you what they did or did not do properly. You get your best results if you use CF functions and CF components, because those are nice and well-structured, compartmentalized things that work the way most normal software development practices work. CF includes have different issues with them that are not quite as great. So the further you get away from CF includes and the further you get towards CF components, the easier your life will be. I know that some of us are stuck building legacy applications. You can't always just snap your fingers and have CF components everywhere, but you can at least start with testbox and do what you can from that, and then migrate your code over to components over time and get better results with it. Installing testbox is as simple as typing that first command, box install testbox. If you take nothing else away from this conference, please take away command box should be by default on all of your machines, whether you're using Coldbox or not. If you don't have command box yet, please fix that as soon as you can. It works, it solves so many problems, not just for Coldbox development, but for testing, for installing things, for automating build processes. It's a great solution for a lot of things. And when you install testbox, you get your testbox folder with all your stuff in it. You get that runner.cfm file that's up there, and that's just how you start running it easily. There are several other ways you can run testbox. That's the quickest one. You get your testbox tests folder. Let me turn that back on. And that looks like so. Here, I'll come over here and stop this one. server start. So here is my test box demo. Let me close these files. And now I'm in server number 2, right here. Test box intro, like that. So I've got a test box folder. Notice there's no cold box folder in there though. So there's no trickery here. I'm not running cold box behind the scenes and faking you out. It simply is test box. The only thing I've changed in this test box folder is in here there is a file called runner.cfm. By default, it looks for my tests in a folder called test/specs. And I simply move that to this folder, my tests. My test is up here. I've got a math utility test file in it, and I'm including that math utils function library we saw earlier, so I simply have it in an INC folder this time in this demo. It's the exact same code as before. And I have my test here, my component, my test box CFC, function run, describe the different mathy things I want to test in here, and then I have 2 of these it blocks. It can add 2 numbers, it can multiply 2 numbers. I run the function, get the value back, and then in test box you have these expect statements. I expect the value to be this thing, or I expect the value to be less than this number, or greater than this number, or whatever the test is that you're looking for. And those run just like you expect them to. Test box, tests, runner.cfm, and yay, there's my tests, and the 2 tests pass, and now I get similar results to what I got with that makeshift testing thing earlier. But just by installing test box, now I get at least more visually pleasing test results. I can get the summary data too. It shows me on the right side 2 tests passed, none failed, none through errors. As my test suite grows in size and complexity, of course, I get other features that test box provides. I can generate CSVs and PDFs. I can run this from a command line and do all kinds of stuff in there that makes other things more useful. I'm going to turn this one off. So we talked a little bit about CF includes. Is anybody still stuck in CF include land? They have to kind of do that, a few people? Okay, I feel your pain. I've had applications like that before too, where you're just kind of screwing with it. There's not a whole lot you can do sometimes to get out of that. I know it's really, really difficult to hit delete all and rebuild the whole thing in a framework. There are some middle ground approaches you can take though to get your code more testable without hitting the nuclear option and starting from scratch. Let's take a look at a couple of those real quick here. Move to server 3. Server start. And while that's booting up, we'll look at option number 3 over here. Can everyone see these code samples okay? Are they readable, by the way? Yes? Okay, good. Sorry, I should have asked about that earlier. All right, so here I've got an include file. There's no CF function or anything on there. It's just a CF query, and you can see down here, it's expecting form variables to be posted into that CF query. We probably have a lot of legacy code that looks similar to this, right? You have an input CFM and a post to that thing, and that's just kind of how it works. It's really hard to write tests for code like this. If I try to write a test like that, it would look about like so. In my previous example, I included the math utility library up at the top of my test file, right? And it was just included in a library, nothing happened. If I tried to include that CF query tag on line 7 where this comment outline is, it would try to run that query. There's no form post going to that file. It would just throw a big error and go, I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here. I would have to do something like this in my test to fake it, right? Make form.variables, even though it's not really a form post happening, and then include that file here inside my test. And that would technically run if I had a data source hooked up to do it, but there's nothing visually connecting this line of code and these 4 form variables up above. If I were a new developer coming into the team to start this project, there's nothing in this file telling me that these 4 things get used in here. I have to drill into every CF include file and look for those form variables and tell, do these things get included in file 1 or file 2 or file 50? It's very disconnected. It's not a great way to write code like this because you can't really test that query, nor is the query reusable in anything other than a form with these 4 exact fields in it. So instead, I can take that query and wrap it in a CF function and then just take arguments on the way in, and instead of form scoped variables, they simply look for things in the argument scope coming in from that method. And now I can take a test, and I can include that CF function library now without anything automatically happening at the wrong point in time of development. And now my test, even though I'm still not in cold box land, my test is just like testing any other chunk of code. Call this function, pass these 4 things in, get my result back, and I can use those expect statements just like I can with any other cold box test. Expect the thing I got back to be true. I didn't really show you that part well. At the bottom of my function, I have return to, just to give the calling code back some sort of flag saying, yes, I ran correctly. In a real app, I'd probably wrap this in like a try-catch block. And if it threw an exception, I'd return false or something along those lines. But for the interest of simplicity in the demo, we shrunk it down a little bit. So there are little things you can do to move your code from this to this that don't mean getting rid of all of your legacy code if you still have to have it in place for whatever reason. But you can do things like just wrap your queries in functions, makes them a little bit more reusable, way more testable. And it took us 5, 6, maybe 7 lines of code, most of which you can copy and paste because they're very similar to each other. Not a terrible middle ground while you're trying to move things out of CF include land and move them more towards modern development. Where did my thing go? All right, testing an actual Callbox app works the exact same way as we saw before. If you just start with command box, you do box Callbox create app, it'll install all your Callbox stuff. It'll give you the skeleton for starting a Callbox app. Part of that skeleton includes test box already installed and configured, ready to go. You get the exact same test box, test runner, CFM thing we just saw a minute ago, except it points to your Callbox app instead of your legacy app. You can test anything with Callbox or with test box, excuse me, generic CFCs, generic CF function libraries like we just saw. You can also test, Callbox events where you go to this Callbox URL and 19 things happen. Testing a generic CFC with test box looks just like we saw with the CF function library examples earlier. I'm in test box now, but still not Callbox. Simply making a new instance of my, in this case, facility CF component. Save that back to a variable, and then I can just write these expect statements again. Expect that that thing is not null. Expect that that thing is of a component type, and it is, in fact, the thing in the models facility folder. It's that type of component. So I can check generic stuff to make sure that my machinery is grabbing the right CFC from the right directory without any Callbox machinery needed. I can still do test box things and get value out of testing my application. And then if I have an actual Callbox event, I can still do real similar things, still testing the test box thing, describe my stuff, get this Callbox thing, check the handler, and then whatever the content is that came back, check to make sure that the text I got on the screen, somewhere it said the words welcome to Callbox. When you do the default Callbox skeleton app, this main/index thing gives you a page that says welcome to Callbox. I'm just doing a generic check to make sure that that machinery is all running properly, and I am in fact getting text on the screen where I expect it to be. So you can check any level of functionality you want with test box, a full-blown Callbox app, or I have a legacy CF include. I need to run that code with a few adjustments. You can check it and check your code that way as well. So regardless of how modern or not modern your application is, there's value in installing test box and finding the spots in your application where you can test that code. That all looks well and good, Nolan, but these are real simple little 2-line functions you've got. I want to see test box do something real world related. Does it actually work when you give it lots of real tests? Here is my application that my team is currently working on. It's called Fuse. We have the same runner CFM file that I saw a demo of, or that I showed you a demo of earlier. While that is spinning up, it takes about 20 or 30 seconds. Here's my code base. So a real application. I'll come back to that Cypress folder in a minute. We have a test folder with various things in it. Here's some tests for my API endpoints. Here's some tests for my model layer, my service layer. It's a total of a couple hundred tests. I'll look at a real quick example of an API one. So user API might be a good one to start with. So this one simply goes to a URL for the API, gives it a token to make sure the API actually works properly, get that URL, deserialize the thing that came back, and I expect that the results I got back to be, I got a status code of 200, meaning my API worked correctly. I expect there to be no errors. I expect it to, the data to have a certain length of whatever it is I'm looking for. You can put however many expect statements you want in your tests. Notice, though, too, that there's no Callbox-specific stuff in here. I can use test box to test an API endpoint, and it still runs properly. And while that's been spinning up, you can see here's that test box suite that I showed you a minute ago. It does, in fact, work for real-world stuff. Some API endpoints in here, some legacy code. I'm checking some Callbox things, some regular just make an object and then make sure the methods run. We're checking the API endpoints in here. And you can see that this is, here, I'll even show you the GitHub repo. This is off my main branch right now with, okay, not quite the latest. Somebody on the team checked in 18 things today, but it's pretty darn close to the latest. 244 tests passed, no fails, no errors. To be fair, that does take a little bit of diligence on the part of all the developers to make sure that we're doing good tests and make sure that the tests are passing every time you check something in. But it is possible to test a whole bunch of stuff of various levels of complexity with or without Coldbox using TestBox. Separate from that, you've got front-end testing. So maybe I have tests that are not specific to, does this page return the text I expect, or does this function return the value I expect? I want to have a series of events. Log in a user, click that button, check that box, type these things into these fields, check that other button, check this button. Do I get the results back after those 19 steps happened? Do I get the results that I expect to get back? You can do that with various front-end testing libraries like Cypress, Concept. There are a handful of other options. The nice thing about front-end testing libraries is they don't care what your backend is written in. Cypress doesn't know that it's a Lucy backend or a COBOL backend or anything else. It just knows that you gave me a URL. I see the results of that thing in my browser. I click on the buttons in whatever order you told me to script out the behavior with. And then Cypress can give you the results of, did the page render the way you expect it to? Did it render in the amount of time you expected it to? Whatever the test is you're looking for. We're using Cypress to do testing on my current project. Just a personal preference. I like the way Cypress, it was really easy to install. I find the syntax and the tools for it to be pretty simple. Concept is a similar JavaScript front-end app. I've used that before. My personal experience was installing Concept and getting it set up to do things was a little bit more of a headache. Cypress sort of just installed and just worked out of the box for me. And then Mocha and Chai are things that Cypress does under the hood baked in for it. So I don't use Mocha by itself or Chai by itself. Cypress does those automatically. The reality is they all do about the same job. So just pick whichever one of them looks prettiest to you and maybe makes the most sense to you in your head and go with that. So the one I like these days is Cypress. It's just chunks of JavaScript. You don't have to learn a new language. You write little JavaScript things to say, go to this URL, click this button. Did you get text on the screen like I expected you to get? Yes or no? And then your test runs. You install it by just doing npx install, or whatever the node command is, node install Cypress, and it shows up. You get a handful with that. You get a handful of command line tools with Cypress to test your application in various ways. One of the things I like most about Cypress is it comes with a great YouTube channel for community support. The folks that make Cypress constantly put out new videos showing new features they've added, best practices on how to do certain things with it. As the web moves forward with new JavaScript frameworks, the Cypress tooling moves forward with it, and they're really good about posting videos showing, here's how to do a Cypress test against a React app or a Vue app, or if your page runs really slowly, or if it's half jQuery and half server rendered, here's what you can do to check some of that stuff out. So one of the things I like about Cypress a lot is just the community support made it really easy to get questions answered as we were checking that out. And a Cypress JS file looks like this. I have a describe block at the top saying I'm going to describe some chunk of user functionality in my app, and then I have it statements. It should log the user in. And you can see below that I have these four SCI statements, SCI for Cypress. These are the Cypress commands. Cypress, go visit that URL. Go get a thing on the screen with an ID of email. Type that into the email box. Go get the thing with an ID of password. Type that in. And then like TestBox has the expect statements. I expect some value to be true or false. Cypress has these should statements. I expect this thing should have a value of my secret password because that's what got typed into the box earlier. The difference in TestBox and Cypress is if you don't have a should statement, like this test down here for logging out, it'll still finish the test and pass without the expect statements being as more of a required kind of thing. If the test gets through both of these lines down here with no problems, you'll get a green check mark saying the test passed. Cypress gives you a CLI. We give you a couple of nice options to make testing easy with that. I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to switch out of my Hello World demos. And now I'll give you, actually, this is a real-world app. This is my Fuse app that we're building. I have to go npx Cypress open. That will give you the Cypress GUI. I've already configured this for my application, so I can skip a couple of the steps. They're pretty easy wizard-like steps, though, to get it configured. I go in and say, please test my app in Chrome. Start doing my end-to-end testing. And that pulls up this folder, Cypress/E2E. That's just a folder in my code base. Cypress E2E. And here's all my tests. So I can go into like authenticate, login.cy.js, show this is a Cypress test. I'm going to describe user authentication, and this test is going to log in an EMC admin user. So log in the user, go to a certain URL, and that URL should include some message on the screen. You can see I have another it statement down here. For this test, it's going to check to make sure a user does not get logged in when they have bad credentials, make sure error messages are displayed correctly when I do something with an error. Tests can be as simple as 1 or 2 lines, or they can get a little bit more involved if you want to check more specific things with it. But to run all the tests in this file, I simply go in here, find that file, and click it. I'm not touching anything now. Now Cypress took over. It pulls up the steps in that Cypress file. Over on the right-hand side, it's hard to see. It actually is rendering the site and doing the different things in those Cypress steps as I go. This is not a video. It's actually running it right now on my laptop. And it tested all of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what is that? 7 or 8 different types of interactions. Log in with valid credentials, log in with invalid credentials, log in with an old credential. Did I get the error message I expected? Did I log in the way I expected? If I log in with this type of user, did I go to the admin page? If I log in with a non-admin user, did I go to the customer page? It checked all of that stuff a heck of a lot faster than me as a human could do it, manually logging in and out on different things. And each of these is a separate set of files that will check something in Cypress. I can close that down, like so. And it gives you, of course, here's your log output as it was running, checking the different tests, which pages gave it login, credential, errors, and what have you. I can also do npx cypress run, and now instead of opening that GUI app, it will simply go through that same folder of E2E files, and it will run the tests here without taking the time to render it visually on my screen. It'll just render it headless, basically, and test all that code. You can see, it's kind of hard to see because it's dark, but it can see that it found 27 Cypress files. It's running the 8 or 10 tests in however many tests there were in that first file. In file number 3, it had X number of tests. Want to watch all 27 of these run today? I'm kidding. You can see this file number 3 had 4 tests in it, 4 tests pass. Really easy to just tell it, run every single test I have in that folder. It takes very little configuration to get up and running with something like that. And I can test all of my front-end stuff. And again, Cypress, Concept, all of these tools, none of them care if your backend is Lucy, .NET, Ruby, Python, whatever. They get a URL, and they interact with it in a web browser just like any other human would interact with your app in a web browser. Downsides to Cypress and downsides to these other similar tools. How good or bad is your HTML markup in your app? If you have broken tags, if you're using table-based HTML for things that are not tables, things like that you're going to have problems with because the select statements that we saw in the Cypress file go get this element with an ID of email address. If you have 2 things on the page with an ID of email address because your stuff is getting included weirdly, that's going to make the selectors go sideways and cause problems. So the better quality code you write, the better quality test results will get out the other side. You don't have to go full-blown cold box, but just make sure that you're actually following good practices for your HTML markup. That goes a long way, not just for making your tests work better. Generally, files with quality markup in them, well-structured files, will render better in the browsers. You get better SEO results. In some situations, you can avoid lawsuits for like accessibility reasons and that sort of thing too. So you just want to always do what you can to write quality markup. It benefits everybody. So this works, but for me to see if all the test box tests ran properly, I have to go to that URL and type that runner.cfm thing in and see them happen. For me to then run all the Cypress tests, I open the terminal and do npx cypress, whatever the command is, and wait the 2 minutes for that to run as well. Earlier in our development process on my app, we would hear this from the developers, I forgot to run the test suites. Oh, that's why it broke. I forgot to check the test box test before I clicked merge into main. Developers are inherently lazy. You can automate those steps as well. So rather than requiring a human to remember to go to that runner CFM URL or remember to type the Cypress thing in, we're using a thing called GitHub Actions. There's a similar thing in Bitbucket called pipelines. AWS has their own option for doing this. Kind of whatever environment you're in, you can do this. We're doing GitHub Actions just because we are. What that lets you do is you can hook these YAML files up to your repo. That's a little bit small, isn't it? Here, I'll open this one. There, that a little better. So you can see here what we did is Anytime someone pushes code to the main branch, or there's a pull request against main, these steps below are going to run out in the GitHub cloud environment. So basically, it's going to spin up a Ubuntu instance. It's going to check out the latest version of our code. It's going to run a small CI bash script that we have. I'll show you that. It just basically checks to make sure that the Docker environment is up and running before the next thing happens. It's not doing anything except waiting for the server to respond with an OK message. It says, yep, I'm good to go. Cool. After that, then it does Cypress run, just like I did from the terminal a minute ago. And it'll run all of my tests out in the Docker cloud in GitHub in the same amount of time it takes a human to run it on their laptop, a couple of minutes. And I can do the same thing with testbox. So I have a testbox YAML file that looks real similar. Anytime someone pushes or does a pull request against main, spin up an instance of Ubuntu, check out the latest version of my code, run that same script just to make sure that my container is up and running properly before the next step happens. Set up some Java stuff, and do box install everything, and then do start my server up and run testbox out in that Docker cloud thing. So now, I never have the issue of a developer on my team saying, oh, I forgot to run all the tests before I checked in the code. Sorry, I broke the build. Now, anytime they check in code, both of these YAML files automatically run. And then I have a third YAML file that says, take the results of those and throw them in the Slack channel. And that way, if someone breaks the build, I immediately get a red box in Slack that says, at 10:45 today, Nolan checked in code and it broke the build. Here's a link to the busted build file. And I can go to the pull request and go, oh, right, I forgot to var scope that variable, or I forgot to add CF query params, or whatever the thing is that screwed up our app. We actually have a third GitHub action that I'm not showing here for running CFLint against our code base too. So it'll check all the code for like missing var scopes and are your variables named properly and stuff too. So the GitHub actions can be really beneficial to helping make sure that you have quality tests coming in and out of your code base. And that stuff all works, again, it's just running testbox. And since we saw testbox will work with old CF includes, you don't have to be on a full-blown Coldbox app to get these benefits out of it. You write a couple YAML files, you come up to your GitHub action repo. They run for free up to a certain number of minutes each month too. You don't have to pay an extra fee for the GitHub actions to be there. If you run them regularly over the month, GitHub keeps track of how many minutes it took to run each action, and you get so many minutes per month per repo for free. And then it's like an Amazon Web Service thing where you just pay so many pennies per extra minutes that you need per month. For this app, just to give you context on it, we have 5 developers right now pushing code every day. I think I pay around $20 a month for a total of Cypress and CFLint and testbox doing all the daily regular stuff. So not a terrible cost for an app in development. So not a whole lot of steps in setting that up. The GitHub actions are probably the most tedious part, but there are a ton of good YouTube videos and documentation out there to set that up. There's a testbox template YAML file you can grab from one of the Ortus repos to get you 90% of the way there on the testbox part. And then the Cypress one, as you saw, was like a third of the size. So it's pretty easy to do that as well. So one of the things I hear about software development, not just testing, but anything sort of fancy or complex being added to a project is often an excuse of I don't have time for that. That's too hard, whatever the thing is. This is really hard to configure. That's why I've never looked at it. It seemed like so much stuff. There's an XML file and a zip file and a thing and an IIS setting. Well, as we saw, testbox is literally one command, box install testbox, and you're done. Cypress is very similar, npm install Cypress, and you're done. Both of them do work as soon as you type that command. You probably want to change a couple of settings to make it look in the right folder for your code or whatever, but you don't have to change anything other than run that install command, and you're done. The other thing I hear a lot, not just for testing, but for moving towards object-oriented programming, moving towards using dependency injection libraries, anything like that, is I don't want to have to type that much. That's a lot of typing. All due respect, that is an invalid excuse, and here's why. Extra typing is a one-time pain point for one developer, and then everybody benefits from it. I benefit now because my code is better quality. My teammates benefit from it now because it's better quality. All of us in 6 months have code that's more self-documented and easier to read and reuse than it was. All of our customers benefit from having better quality code. And really, how much extra typing are you going to spend on converting a thing into a CF function. A couple of minutes, maybe. I'm certain everyone here is using VS Code or Sublime, or nobody's writing code in Notepad day in, day out, right? You're all using a modern IDE editor. All of them have macros and extensions and plugins and features built into them to make extra typing rapid fire super quick to do. It's like next time you take a 5-minute break, pull up YouTube, look for a VS Code tip. They have tons of 5-minute videos on there you can look at to learn how to do this stuff more quickly. The extra typing thing really is a non-issue for everyone these days, I promise. And on the test box side too, in VS Code, the Ortus guys just released a new version of their test box extension that makes doing test box stuff in VS Code even more efficient than it was 7 days ago. Sometimes people feel overwhelmed when they see all this new stuff. Take a breath. You do not have to go full-blown GitHub Actions and Cypress and CFLint and Testbox all on the same day. We have that stuff in our app now because over the last year, my 5 developers have all split that work up and done it in different points in time as we've needed those new updates there. We did not start with Cypress and Testbox and CFLint and everything else. That's all been, we started with nothing and just did manual testing, then went, okay, this is stupid, let's add Testbox and get a couple of those things in. And we just had Testbox testing like basic CFC stuff for a little while. And then just as the app grew, so did our test suite. There's no bad place to start testing your app. Do whatever you can do to start and go from there. The dream is, of course, 100% test coverage where every line of code is checked. Eventually, things head that direction, but you're not going to get there on day one. That's just not realistic. One thing we do that helps, too, though, is over in our Jira board. So here's where all the development happens for my team. New tickets we're working on, and they're in progress. When something's in QA, we actually have a QA column for it, which means somebody's testing it, and then once they've physically run the test box and Cypress tests, and they've manually clicked on the things to make sure it does what it's supposed to do, we have another column called pull request review, where the code actually gets looked at, and that gives us a spot to stop and go, okay, I see you wrote 3 new functions. I don't see 3 new matching tests to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do. I can kick the code back to the developer before it goes into main and say, please write more tests for this. You didn't cover it fully enough. And it gives us a stopgap to make sure, hey, this is really important. You got to write a unit test for that before we integrate it just to be on the safe side. So you can do things like that, too, that help move the test forward kind of on an as-needed basis within your team. Hopefully this does not seem like it was too much to learn. Like on the test box side, you're just writing CF script. The only thing new really is that expect statement, expect something to be this value. On the Cypress or CodeCept side, you have those cy.dot commands, cy.visit, and then the should commands. Everything else is just plain JavaScript. You don't have to install TypeScript and compile them or anything fancy like that. It's just a little bit of syntax, and you can test your front end, or a little bit of syntax, and you can test your back end, or both. And if you hadn't noticed, the test suites are very similar to each other as well. Like our Cypress one had a describe statement and then these it blocks, right? It should do this thing, it should do that thing. Test box statements, very similar. Describe, it should do this thing, it should do another thing. That's not coincidence, and that's not me doing trickery to make this stuff seem more similar than it is. Here's what an Angular test looks like. If you just do the Angular skeleton app to start with Angular, describe something, it should do this, it should do next. Angular even has expect statements just like Testbox does. So testing tools that are out there for basically all the modern platforms all work in a very, very similar fashion. It's really easy to start with one and then add the others later as you need to move your application forward. You don't have to start from scratch with any of them. Everything you learn in one pretty much maps over to the other tools that are available. So just start doing testing in your app wherever the easiest point of entry is for you and your team, and then build on it from there. Some other stuff that can help along the way. Use source control. If you're not using GitHub or Bitbucket, please start using GitHub or Bitbucket. Everyone on the team should follow the same branching strategy. Like by default, you'll have a branch called main. Make new branches for your features and bugs. Make sure everyone on your team is following that. Don't let people check code into main. That's a red flag for a bunch of reasons. Write the tests. When you write the code, sometimes I have developers, I'll say, like, I finished the feature, but I'll get the test tomorrow. Like, no, write the test now, and then we'll check all your code in and check it together. And sometimes that takes a little bit of extra discipline at first to get used to, like, I wrote the code, but I got to write the test too. There's a thing called test-driven development that sometimes makes that easier. The idea there is you write the test first, then you write the code afterward. When I write things like API endpoints or function libraries, Often doing the test first helps make that process go more smoothly, because I'm going to have to think what the API endpoint is going to look like or what the function signature is going to look like before I can write the code anyway. I might as well write that stuff in the test and then fill in the guts of the function afterward. Don't deploy code on Fridays is always a good idea, whether you're writing your test or not. And then anything you can do to move your code into using frameworks is just going to help you longer overall. I know those of us that are stuck with legacy apps, that is way easier said than done, but whatever you can do to head towards a structured direction, even if it's just a bunch of CF function calls, that'll just make your code a little more easy to do. And then there's people who talked to at this conference. The Cypress videos are great, like I mentioned. CFcast.com is fantastic. The Orders folks are fantastic. I have a presentation I gave here a couple of years ago called Testing My Non-Coldbox Site with Testbox that can help people that are stuck in those situations. I think I have 1 minute left, and that's how to get a hold of me if you want to chat later, or I'll be out here at the break and stuff too. So thanks for listening, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.